The lunch break that unraveled everything. How I discovered my husband's 4-year deception. I remember standing motionless at the base of the staircase, my fingers numb from the weight of the shopping bag I was clutching. Above me, drifting down through the stillness of our home, came my husband's voice. But it wasn't the strained, suffering sound of a man battling a temperature of 102 degrees. Instead, I heard laughter. Genuine, unguarded laughter, the kind he hadn't directed my way in years. The sort of easy warmth that predated the careful politeness our marriage had gradually become. Then came the words that would forever cleave my life into 2 distinct periods, before and after. "Don't worry," he said with casual certainty. "She'll never find out." My body went rigid. My lungs seemed to forget their purpose. 22 years dissolved in an instant, and I understood with absolute clarity that I had married a stranger. My name is Susan Clark, and I'm 45 years old. Until that particular Tuesday in March, I would have described my marriage as something rather wonderful in its ordinariness. We didn't possess the passionate intensity of our early 20s, but we possessed something I valued far more: steadiness, reliability, the comfortable rhythm of 2 people who had genuinely built something together. The kind of partnership where you perform small kindnesses without calculation, where you anticipate each other's sentences at social gatherings, where signing documents placed before you feels like an act of faith rather than suspicion. I work in the claims division of a moderately sized insurance company based in Spokane, a position that provides adequate compensation while typically allowing me to leave by 5 o'clock. My husband, Thomas, had constructed a modest HVAC repair operation entirely through his own effort, beginning in a rented garage space and gradually expanding to the point where he could finally afford to bring on additional staff. We'd encountered one another during our 20s at someone's backyard gathering, married within 18 months, and spent the subsequent 2 decades methodically constructing what I genuinely believed was a life we'd never willingly abandon. That morning proceeded entirely unremarkably. Thomas rang me before 7:30, his speech thick and hesitant, explaining that he'd awakened with a fever and a headache severe enough to blur his vision. He mentioned staying horizontal, perhaps taking pain relief medication, and attempting to sleep through whatever infection had taken hold. I encouraged him toward rest, made a kissing sound toward the phone receiver, that automatic gesture couples perform without thinking, and proceeded with my workday as though nothing were amiss. By mid-morning, though, concern began settling over me in that particular way you worry about someone who's shared half your existence. Was he adequately hydrated? Had he consumed anything? When my lunch interval arrived, instead of joining my colleagues, I decided to make a detour through the local market. I selected the items you gather for someone unwell. That specific brand of soup he preferred, juice with substantial pulp content, saltine squares, the cherry-flavored medicinal syrup he grumbled about while continuing to consume. Standing in the queue, I pictured myself arriving home unannounced, arranging everything on a tray beside his bed, the sort of romantic gesture we'd once thought revolutionary during our younger, financially constrained years. I drove homeward with windows partially open, singing lightly to the radio, experiencing something adjacent to contentment. I had no awareness whatsoever that I was traveling toward the dissolution of everything I believed I understood about my own existence. I entered through the side entrance, the one that operates silently, moving with deliberate quiet so as not to disturb him if sleep had finally arrived. The residence was shadowed, with curtains pulled closed against the daylight. For a fragment of time, all appeared exactly right. I positioned the market bag on the kitchen counter and began ascending the staircase, mentally rehearsing how I might playfully suggest he truly owed me his appreciation, given the sacrifice of my entire break. That's when I heard it. His voice carrying easily from beyond our bedroom threshold, not the weak, labored breathing of a feverish person, but clear, confident, animated, not the voice of someone suffering through illness. I halted midway up the steps, my palm flattening against the wooden rail, my pulse shifting into something heavy and unfamiliar. He wasn't speaking to himself. There was an unmistakable rhythmic quality, the back-and-forth pattern of active dialogue with another person. My first assumption, the one a wife makes when she's spent more than 2 decades assuming good intentions, was that perhaps he was managing business concerns with his maintenance partner, the sort of C. Conversation he'd conduct even from a hospital mattress if necessary. He's always operated that way, Thomas. Perpetually responsive to professional demands regardless of circumstance. So I remained there, not eavesdropping precisely, merely waiting for an appropriate moment to announce my presence. And then he laughed, that warm, relaxed, unguarded laugh I hadn't experienced directed toward me in longer than felt comfortable acknowledging. A second voice, unmistakably feminine and completely unfamiliar, responded softly enough that initially I couldn't distinguish the actual words, though the cadence was unmistakable. Something primitive awakened within me, an ancient biological recognition system that understood the contours of treachery before my conscious awareness could fully process what was occurring. I remained absolutely stationary on that landing, my grip tightening around the banister as though it were the only object anchoring me to stability, and I permitted myself to listen intently. That's when he articulated the sentence I would carry in my thoughts throughout the remainder of my existence. "Don't worry," he said, his tone almost dismissive, as if discussing meteorological conditions rather than dismantling the foundational aspects of my understanding of who we were as a couple. "She'll never find out." I didn't experience tears. I didn't immediately thrust the door open and demand responses the way I might have expected of myself. Some deeper, more pragmatic consciousness took deliberate mental notes instead. 2 decades of trust, and suddenly I comprehended that I possessed virtually no understanding of what I was about to discover. I remained on that landing for something approaching an hour, though in actuality probably closer to 90 seconds. My entire physiology was caught between the compulsion to burst through that entrance and a colder, more protective instinct insisting I remain precisely where I was. I chose listening. I've never felt greater gratitude for a single decision in my entire adult existence. As my auditory senses acclimated, as my panic-flooded brain finally permitted actual sound processing, the woman's voice became increasingly distinct. She wasn't employing the hushed, conspiratorial tone I'd have anticipated from someone engaged in romantic infidelity. Her communication style was crisp, methodical, almost detached. "Are you certain Susan authorized everything?" she inquired, and something within that phrasing triggered recognition in my consciousness. Not "does Susan understand?" Not "will Susan become aware of our involvement?" The question centered on authorization documentation. Those weren't the words of someone concealing a romantic entanglement. Those were the words of someone confirming paperwork completion. "Everything," Thomas responded without hesitation, and I discerned something within his vocal quality I'd never previously identified, a particular satisfaction entirely disconnected from romantic context. "All of it's in my name currently," he continued. "Complete authority." He laughed that same unbothered laugh and referenced something about how I'd authorized whatever documentation he positioned in front of me across the years, and I'd never once questioned anything. My complexion flushed hot with humiliation that wasn't legitimately mine to experience. Yet he was correct, and that constituted the genuinely devastating component. I had indeed authorized materials, forms he'd characterized as refinancing documents during the previous autumn. He'd presented them at our kitchen table using a folder and pen, explaining these represented routine financial adjustments to assist his business during a challenging seasonal period. I'd inscribed my name across multiple pages without genuinely reading any of them, because that had become our partnership's fundamental structure. He administered monetary matters. I extended trust. 2 decades of marriage had constructed that particular arrangement. I didn't immediately enter the room, and I want to be forthright about that particular choice, because I recognize that many individuals would anticipate the theatrical confrontation. The outraged spouse flinging open the door, demanding identification of this woman, questioning her presence in our residence while discussing my signature as though it were commercial property. However, something deeper, something quietly resolute that I hadn't previously recognized within myself, comprehended that direct confrontation would surrender advantage to him. He would fabricate explanations. He would soften the narrative. He would construct some persuasive storyline, the way accomplished deceptionists invariably manage, and I would be too emotionally overwhelmed, too internally shattered to perceive through the artifice. Instead, I retreated down those stairs methodically, each footfall deliberate and measured, my palm pressed flat against the interior wall for equilibrium. And I exited through that identical side entrance that operates without sound. I remained seated inside my vehicle in the driveway for a complete minute, my hands quaking, not from sorrow specifically, but from the sheer cognitive disorientation. 2 decades of predictable rhythms, Sunday mornings and weekday dinners, his customary gesture of reaching for my hand during emotionally affecting cinema, and underneath everything, apparently, there existed another iteration of him conducting an entirely separate existence. I drove back toward my workplace on automatic, barely registering traffic signals, my consciousness circling that single question repeatedly. Are you certain Susan authorized everything? What had I actually authorized? What exactly had I put my name to? Once I'd parked in my workplace's underground structure, I'd formulated a resolution, though I didn't yet comprehend its complete framework. I wouldn't interrogate Thomas regarding what was occurring. I wouldn't offer him opportunity to construct explanations around whatever this represented. I would conduct my own investigation, quietly, methodically, before he possessed any inkling that I'd discovered anything whatsoever. Throughout that afternoon, seated at my workspace, ostensibly addressing insurance documentation, my consciousness reviewed every document I could recollect authorizing during the previous 12 months. There had been considerably more than I wanted to acknowledge. A folder presented here, a form requested there, consistently presented identically, consistently framed as something mundane, something requiring no genuine consideration from a professionally occupied woman with her own responsibilities and obligations. Thomas had engineered an entire architecture constructed upon my unwavering confidence, and I had never once questioned it, because questioning would have necessitated confronting that perhaps I'd never genuinely understood my own spouse as thoroughly as I'd presumed. I also couldn't cease contemplating that woman's vocal quality. There had existed nothing intimate within it, nothing suggestive of romantic involvement, nothing implying passion. It was the acoustic manifestation of someone executing business, somebody operating from a prepared list. That unsettled me considerably more profoundly than straightforward infidelity might have. That evening, I returned home and prepared our meal as if nothing had transpired. I inquired about his physical condition. He reported that his temperature had diminished, that he'd slumbered through most of the afternoon. I acknowledged his explanation, offered him the soup I'd purchased for a man who apparently hadn't required it, and positioned myself across the kitchen table from him, suddenly uncertain for the initial time in our 22-year relationship regarding who this individual genuinely was. Over the subsequent several days, I maintained absolute silence with Thomas. I behaved naturally during morning beverages. I posed questions about his work schedules. I permitted him to believe that the individual who'd visited him via telephone had gone completely unnoticed, that his supposedly ailing wife's lunch hour visit had concluded with harmlessness he'd anticipated. Meanwhile, operating beneath that composed exterior, I was executing investigation with significantly greater concentration than I'd ever dedicated to anything throughout my existence. My initial action involved contacting our financial institution on a Thursday morning from the solitude of my vehicle in my workplace parking garage, my coffee growing cold as I held on the line. I requested comprehensive account statements spanning the previous 3 complete years. The representative inquired whether something appeared problematic. I explained I simply intended to examine our financial picture, the most substantial understatement of my entire adult experience. The documentation arriving over subsequent days dismantled something within my chest, one record at a time. There emerged accounts I didn't recognize. Not disguised accounts precisely, not the narrative-style offshore numbered arrangements, but domestic investment portfolios established under exclusively Thomas's designation, financial borrowing funded through transfers from accounts I'd believed remained mutually held. There was a residence equity credit instrument I'd never been informed about, extended against nearly 60% of our property ownership percentage. There existed a mortality protection contract wherein the recipient designation had been quietly modified 11 months prior. My identity had been eliminated and replaced with something designated as the Clark Family Trust, an entity I had never heard referenced and certainly never provided authorization to establish. I engaged an attorney during the subsequent week. Her name was Diane Ackefer, a perceptive, measured professional operating from a downtown corner office, WH. O listened to my comprehensive narrative without interrupting her pen, documenting everything across her legal pad. Upon completion, she positioned the writing instrument down and posed a question I would retain throughout my remaining existence. "Susan," she commenced, "when Thomas requested you authorize these materials, did he ever articulate specifically what you were authorizing before you executed your signature?" I attempted genuine recollection. The factual response was negative. He'd comment about refinancing or mention that his accounting specialist required documentation for fiscal administration, and I would authorize it because I extended confidence. Because 2 decades of matrimony should represent something meaningful. Because I maintained employment and inhabited my own existence. Because I genuinely never contemplated requiring self-protection against my own spouse. Diane assembled records across the subsequent 2-week period that illustrated something substantially more expansive than uncomplicated romantic betrayal. What I'd overheard through that bedroom entrance represented something fundamentally different, or at minimum, not fundamentally romantic. The feminine voice I'd heard belonged to someone named Patricia Vance, a specialized financial professional Thomas had been engaging for more than 1 year, someone whose professional description emphasized asset reorganization and wealth transfer facilitation. I recall examining that terminology displayed on my personal computing device at late evening, Thomas slumbering beside me, and experiencing something frigid settling within my internal organs. This wasn't romantic involvement. This represented a woman facilitating the systematic dismantling of our married financial reality, document after document, while I authorized whatever he presented and maintained faith in the same individual since I was 23 years old. As Diane's investigation advanced, the sequential development materialized with frightening clarity and proved substantially more troubling than I'd permitted myself to envision. This hadn't initiated recently. The earliest document modification she uncovered extended back approximately 4 years, an unremarkable alteration to a pension account designation I might have authorized without consideration during some forgotten evening. From that foundation, the sequence developed gradually, methodically, resembling a craftsman positioning bricks individually so that the constructed barrier would never appear to be under development. Property designations transferred. Investment portfolios concentrated exclusively under his individual designation. Business restructuring that quietly repositioned the HVAC Enterprise's commodity holdings away from anything I could pursue during matrimonial dissolution. I observed that development timeline distributed across Diane's workspace one Tuesday afternoon. 4 years of my signature scattered throughout documentation I genuinely never carefully examined, and I experienced something shifting within my emotional landscape that merged disappointment with accumulating indignation. Grief regarding the partnership I'd imagined, the one where we created collectively, where confidence existed as something shared rather than a weapon one individual meticulously refined against another, combined with intensifying fury regarding how effectively he'd weaponized precisely those characteristics that define me as a devoted spouse. My dependence, my occupational demands, my readiness to grant him authority regarding our monetary picture became the mechanisms of my own potential ruin. Diane regarded me with particular attention before I departed her workplace that particular day. "There exists additional context you ought to comprehend," she communicated. "From what my investigation reveals in the most recent documentation submissions, Thomas seems positioned to execute something considerably more substantial, something potentially imminent." I questioned what that suggested. She communicated that she required additional temporal space to substantiate her suspicions, but she wanted me prepared for the possibility that whatever Thomas was orchestrating, it was approaching execution, and preventing it would prove substantially more complicated than stopping it beforehand. I navigated homeward that afternoon past the residence I'd inhabited throughout 18 years, past the landscaping I'd cultivated personally, and I recognized with terrifying specificity that I'd transformed from a spouse who'd inadvertently discovered something concerning into a female human, positioned at the precipice of comprehensive financial devastation, joined in matrimony to someone who'd been systematically constructing my complete financial annihilation. Diane initiated contact on a Monday morning, her communication conveying intensity I hadn't previously identified. "I require your presence immediately," she communicated. "Not sometime this week. Today." I informed my workplace superior that I possessed a pressing personal situation, which constituted absolute truthfulness, though a drastically minimized version, and I navigated downtown with my fingers locked firmly around my steering apparatus, bracing against whatever she'd discovered. She possessed the comprehensive picture currently, or sufficient proximity to it. Thomas wasn't simply transferring monetary resources to guarantee business security, the narrative he might have manufactured if anyone had ever requested clarification. He was preparing to liquidate our residence. The property I'd inhabited for 18 years, complete with my personal landscaping, and the kitchen area I'd personally redesigned using monetary resources from my independent earnings, was presently recorded through a title company under an accelerated transfer arrangement, the category designed for speculative investors avoiding complication. Diane located that paperwork through accessible public documentation exploration, a preliminary title modification request submitted merely 8 days previous. Thomas had mentioned nothing. Not a suggestion, nothing indicating displeasure, nothing. That wasn't even the most distressing revelation. He'd additionally initiated an accelerated pension portfolio withdrawal request, the category triggering substantial monetary penalties but producing immediate liquid funds. And Patricia Vance's enterprise had facilitated his establishment of a new financial account, positioned in an alternative geographical jurisdiction, that category of monetary institution emphasizing rapid, inconspicuous transfers. Diane positioned the materials across her workspace resembling puzzle components from an arrangement I'd never desired to assemble: residence, pension, contemporary accounts, business restructuring that had currently repositioned the HVAC, enterprise's resources, and operational agreements into a newly established organization listing Thomas as exclusive proprietor with zero reference to me. Despite my earlier co-authorization of the authentic enterprise financial obligation 19 years previously, and my countless uncompensated weekends handling his accounting materials before he possessed resources to engage professional assistance. "Additional information remains," Diane communicated, her intonation prompting me toward heightened alertness. She positioned a reproduced borrowing contract across her desktop. Thomas had processed a monetary loan 6 months previous, utilizing our residence as monetary guarantee, the identical residence he was presently quietly positioning for liquidation outside both our legal authority. Assuming his strategy progressed as Diane hypothesized, I would maintain virtually nothing. Not the property, not the pension monetary resources I'd accumulated across 2 complete decades, not even defensible legal positioning to argue for the commercial enterprise I'd personally facilitated building throughout its initial, most challenging developmental stage, operating insufficient sleep intervals, while Thomas acquired plumbing and electronic installation proficiency from a borrowed automobile's rear compartment. I sat immobile within that leather seating apparatus, examining the documentation, and I experienced something internally that astonished me. It wasn't panic, although panic would have represented an appropriate reaction. Instead, I perceived an unusual clarifying settling, the category emerging when you ultimately comprehend an actual threat's configuration rather than merely sensing it within darkness. Thomas possessed confidence I might characterize as arrogance, constructed from 22 years of my unconditional reliance, that I would never scrutinize records, that I maintained excessive occupational responsibility, that I possessed excessive devotion to matrimony to ever examine sufficiently carefully to recognize his actions. He'd engineered everything upon the presumption that Susan Clark represented the classification of female individual who never posed difficult questioning. He maintained no awareness how thoroughly he was about to be disproven. "What direction do you want to pursue?" Diane inquired, and I recognized she wasn't only questioning regarding courtroom approach. She was questioning who I aspired to represent at this juncture, confronted with someone I'd maintained faith in across more than 2 complete decades, methodically preparing to separate me from everything I'd personally created. I might have journeyed homeward that evening and confronted him across our dining arrangement, positioned the documentation before him, and mandated clarifications, observing him fabricate an explanation, the category I'm certain he'd prepared. Something persuasive appearing, reasonable sounding, calculated to purchase temporal distance permitting him to conclude his preparations. I determined otherwise. I'm not interested in alerting him, I communicated to Diane. I want to permit him to continue imagining he maintains advantage. She examined me momentarily, and something resembling professional respect materialized across her countenance. She'd witnessed numerous matrimonial clients positioned identically to me, she subsequently clarified, and most requested prompt confrontation, the psychological discharge of ultimately expressing things externally. Comparatively few possess the composure required to maintain the anguish quietly and observe their spouse continue extending themselves across a precipice already fracturing. However, I comprehended something Thomas didn't. Every temporary interval he invested thinking he'd succeeded constituted additional temporal intervals Diane could invest constructing an impenetrable legal position, preserving monetary resources before he could relocate them, recording every monetary movement before he could obscure it through fresh documentation. If I confronted him presently, he would obtain capacity to conceal evidence, reimagine the complete arrangement as misinterpretation, employ his independent attorneys, and pull everything into protracted conflict where authenticity became indeterminate and expensive. If I maintained patience, if I permitted him continuing confidence in his advantage, he would perpetuate manufacturing inaccuracies, continuing authorizing his individual deterioration completely unaware that his spouse, the one he'd never bothered comprehending as anything except reliant and occupied and simple to manipulate, was 3 increments ahead and systematically closing distance. I journeyed homeward that evening and prepared sustenance. Thomas appeared smelling of metallic components and inquired regarding my day's events. I communicated it had been calm, unexciting, routine. I observed him consume this individual I'd maintained affection for throughout more than half my existence, and I experienced something calcifying internally that I recognized would maintain me throughout whatever subsequently transpired. 3 temporal intervals progressed, and I transformed into someone I barely acknowledged in reflective surfaces every morning. A female human capable of positioning herself across a dining arrangement from her companion and inquiring about his work circumstances while carrying comprehensive consciousness of his preparations to erase her economic existence. It wasn't uncomplicated. There existed nocturnal periods I remained conscious beside Thomas, processing his breathing patterns, contemplating how an individual could inhabit sleeping quarters with someone for more than 2 complete decades and maintain capability of executing what he was implementing. However, every sunrise, I reminded myself of Diane's communication. Tolerance presently constituted impartiality afterward. Precipitation presently constituted comprehensive devastation. Diane operated rapidly across those 3 intervals, considerably faster than I genuinely recognized during the moment. She submitted emergency injunctions, halting the monetary accounts, before Thomas could accomplish his ultimate relocation objective. She transmitted official documentation to the real estate organization administering the residence liquidation, signaling my possession interest, successfully postponing the accelerated purchase arrangement Thomas had been relying upon. She contacted the financial organization, where he'd generated his contemporary out-of-state financial institution, and initiated the methodology of acquiring documentation through legal mandate. Every component positioned systematically, quietly, while Thomas maintained his customary schedule, completely unconscious that structural support underneath him had previously begun fracturing. Subsequently, on a Thursday evening in initial April, Thomas appeared at our residence earlier than customary, transporting a manila container I instantly recognized, the identical classification he'd utilized for every document he'd ever positioned across our kitchen arrangement, requesting my authorization. He positioned it gently, nearly reverently, and communicated that his accounting specialist required one additional authorization to finalize some restructuring for the business, something regarding liability protections considering present marketplace factors. His intonation was affectionate, gentle, even reassuring. He positioned his manipulation on my shoulder the manner he had performed when we existed in preliminary matrimonial phases, and for one singular instant, something exhausted and elderly within me desperately wanted to believe him. Wanted to convince myself this continued being the individual I'd embraced during that party approximately 2 complete decades previously. Just additional authorization, he articulated, positioning the container toward me with a comfortable, confidence-inspiring expression. I expressed action toward him. I communicated I'd review the material following consumption, that I simply desired completing preparation initially. He acknowledged, fulfilled, and departed toward his workplace, humming something inside his consciousness, completely guaranteed that his spouse, the reliant, occupied, incurious female he imagined marrying, was about to supply precisely the ultimate component he required. What Thomas maintained zero awareness of was that Diane and I'd previously established preparation for this particular circumstance. We'd anticipated he would ultimately present me with concluding material, something engineered to finalize whatever remaining economic properties still necessitated my authorization, and we'd architected everything around readiness the exact second that container materialized. That nocturnal period, after Thomas transitioned to sleeping quarters, I positioned myself at my kitchen arrangement and contacted Diane's personal communication apparatus, the identification she'd supplied for exactly this circumstance. I explained the material, photographed every segment thoroughly, and transmitted them to her prior to contemplating authorization. She telephoned backward within 20 temporal intervals, her intonation carrying something resembling triumphant urgency I'd not previously identified. The material Thomas had transported wasn't protection authorization documentation in any way. It constituted the concluding authorization for our ultimate remaining joint economic portfolio. The individual remaining economic possession, still legally affiliated with both existing parties, would transform exclusively into his authority. Completing what Diane currently hypothesized was his concluding phase. Don't authorize, she communicated, and don't express to him anything appears incorrect. We possess preparation. I simply require 48 temporal intervals. Those 48 temporal intervals constituted the elongated I'd previously experienced. I functioned specifically as I'd done across temporal intervals, expressing warmth beside morning beverages, inquiring regarding his workplace assignments, observing him acknowledge with that identical comfortable confidence, that identical guarantee that I would execute exactly what I'd consistently performed. Meanwhile, Diane was functioning approximately the temporal measurement. She submitted the crisis injunction formally into courtroom procedures, mentioning the monetary transfer arrangement as indication of financial misbehavior inside matrimonial partnership. She transmitted the preservation request to each monetary entity Thomas had contacted across the previous 4 complete years. Everything transpired simultaneously on Friday morning. Diane contacted communicating that the tribunal authorized the crisis preservation. Every account Thomas had generated, every monetary movement he'd begun, every monetary unit he'd attempted quietly redirecting beyond my authority, stopped comprehensive, secured permanently through a magistrate's arrangement prior to him acquiring consciousness that anything was happening. The residence liquidation was terminated. The pension withdrawal petition was maintained in partial suspension. The contemporary out-of-state economic institution, the one he and Patricia Vance had generated specifically to obtain whatever concluding monetary resources originated from that concluding joint portfolio, exhibited a preservation indicator the instant that monetary organization obtained Diane's document acquisition request. I was positioned at my employment workspace when Diane contacted with intelligence, and I required departing toward the feminine hygiene facility, locking inside a compartment, positioning my manipulator across my oral cavity. Not from emotional devastation, this instance, but from something adjacent to absolute liberation, so comprehensive it practically forced me toward my own foundations. For 4 complete years, Thomas had been quietly, deliberately dismantling everything we'd created jointly. Guaranteed I would never examine, never question, never resist. And on one isolated Friday morning, everything he'd invested time constructing systematically deteriorated in mere temporal intervals without him ever comprehending it approaching. That evening, I navigated toward residence, knowing Thomas had probably already identified something was incorrect. I breathed deliberately prior to entering through that entrance, conditioning myself regarding what anticipated inside. He positioned himself inside our kitchen area when I entered, his communication apparatus within his manipulator, his complexion resembling something absent of moisture. I'd not previously observed Thomas appear that fashion, not across 22 complete years, not through enterprise complications or domestic arguments, or the particular year his biological male parent expired and melancholy obliterated him for extended temporal intervals. This represented something different. This constituted an individual observing every deliberately positioned component of his arrangement systematically disintegrate in authentic temporal progression. And he maintained zero consciousness that I'd constituted the entity who displaced it. Susan, his intonation fractured across my designation. Something's incorrect regarding the accounts. Everything's maintained preservation. The residence liquidation failed. I can't achieve the banking entity in Nevada. They're declining my telephonic communication. He examined me, the fashion you examine someone you anticipate emotional support from, someone positioned to exist as your companion regardless. And for singular momentary duration, I felt something resembling historical automatic response activate. The automatic response of a spouse, maintaining 2 complete decades of mollifying this individual's distresses. I permitted it to traverse me and position itself internally. I'm aware, I communicated. He remained completely motionless. What do you indicate you're cognizant? I positioned my carrying apparatus onto the kitchen arrangement with sluggish, calculated placement, the fashion you'd position something weighty you'd maintained, transporting considerable temporal distance. I'm aware regarding everything, Thomas. I'm aware regarding Patricia. I'm aware regarding the accounts. I'm aware regarding the residence. I perceived you that day I appeared at home throughout my temporary break. I perceived everything you articulated upstairs. Observing his complexion modify represented possibly the most peculiar sensation of my whole existence. There wasn't singular, instantaneous deterioration. It progressed in sequential stages, resembling observing architecture dismantle story by story. Initially confusion, as he computed what I authentically comprehended. Subsequently something resembling comfort, the exhausting mass of maintaining hidden information, ultimately being positioned downward. Subsequently, as you'd anticipate, resentment, sharp and protective. The resentment manifested by someone who just acknowledged the narrative he'd been maintaining regarding his individual righteousness, no longer subsists inside another individual's recognition. You don't comprehend, he articulated, his intonation intensifying. I was maintaining the commerce secure. Do you appreciate what materializes if that HVAC establishment collapsed? I was maintaining our existence secure, Susan, our retirement arrangements, everything. Through obscuring it from me, I queried, maintaining controlled intonation, which astonished even me. Through positioning the residence into accelerated liquidation I never approved. Through generating accounts in another geographical location. Thomas, you weren't maintaining our existence secure. You were engineering yourself an avenue for departure. He lacked satisfactory response to that. Not an authentic one. He attempted periodically across the subsequent temporal intervals, each description marginally different regarding the previous one, each one disintegrating considerably quicker compared to the previous version. As Diane methodically displayed the materials she'd compiled, absolutely zero area persisted for him to navigate. She exposed the development across the mediation arrangement, the subsequent temporal interval. 4 complete years of materials, distributed across the arrangement resembling confession, he generated himself with no conscious intention. Electronic communications between Thomas and Patricia, Vance examining monetary protection, approaches employing terminology that no authentic economic planning would ever need. The refinancing materials I'd authorized positioned adjacent the genuine property modification materials they'd been quietly appended to. Materials bearing my designation on segments, I'd authentically never experienced displayed. Monetary transfer documentation. Signature modification on the mortality contract, wherein Diane's specialized professional in handwriting confirmed beneath official declaration was not performed by me. That concluding component fractured something inside the atmosphere. Thomas's independent legal representative, a fatigued individual who'd plainly obtained considerably less information than his personal customer should have supplied him, transitioned to comprehensive silence regarding the deception verification emerging. Forging another person's signature isn't simply relationship betrayal. It constitutes criminal activity. And everybody inside that position comprehended precisely what that suggested. Communication propagates swiftly within towns our proportions. Throughout following 2 temporal intervals, individuals we'd maintained connection with across years commenced transmitting messages, some to me with composed, attentive compassion, additional to Thomas with the classification of interpersonal separation that communicates what they'd currently absorbed. His enterprise companion, a person designated Rick, who'd functioned alongside Thomas practically 1 complete decade, terminated their cooperative arrangement agreement entirely after the deception accusations transformed into community documentation. Multiple of his most substantial enterprise purchasers quietly transferred their operational contracts elsewhere. Even his individual biological relative, who'd perpetually supported Thomas throughout domestic conflicts I could recollect, terminated addressing his contact messages. I didn't undergo pleasure observing it materialize. Not specifically. There didn't manifest triumphant comfort experiencing someone I'd maintained affection for throughout lengthy temporal intervals forfeit the professional admiration of every individual encompassing him. However, there manifested something else, something quieter and steadier. Emotional experience I can only characterize as comfort of ultimately positioning myself inside objective reality, subsequent to 4 complete years of unconsciously existing inside somebody's deliberately engineered deceptive environment. I'd position myself inside the reliant partner identification for lengthy duration, the occupied one, the one who authorized what positioned itself in front of her and never posed difficult questioning. Observing that identification ultimately deteriorate, substituted through a female human who'd identified the determination to push quietly and consistently regarding what was legitimately mine, experienced comparable to consciousness raising subsequent to extended rest. Thomas departed from the residence approximately 3 temporal intervals afterward into temporary housing approximation to his business operation, perpetually advocating to anybody receptive that he'd exclusively ever wanted securing everything we'd assembled collectively. Nobody maintained confidence in him afterward. I'm uncertain by conclusion that he even maintained confidence in himself. 1 complete temporal year has concluded since that Tuesday. I appeared during my temporary break, transporting soup and fluid for an individual who wasn't genuinely experiencing sickness. I currently occupy a smaller residence presently, single sleeping quarters instead of 4, a modest cooking area where I prepare heated beverage every morning and process it, gradually watching illumination gradually emerge across a community I'd never inhabited 1 temporal year previously. I maintain less compared to I'd previously possessed. Reduced square measurement, reduced possessions, considering I transferred majority of the furniture originating from our historical existence instead of transferring its burden into this contemporary stage. However, I have never, not 1 instance throughout these 12 temporal intervals, experienced as weightless like I'm experiencing presently. The matrimonial dissolution procedures required 8 temporal intervals for concluding, instead of what Diane had anticipated, extended compared to what I'd been anxious regarding, provided every scenario Thomas's lawyers attempted proposing throughout the process. Ultimately, the falsified designation on the mortality coverage designation transformed into the component absolutely nobody could articulate around. It represented something beyond monetary deceptiveness. It constituted recognized criminal activity, and once that comprehension positioned itself across the discussion arrangement, Thomas's potential alternatives contracted substantially. I departed with 50% of resources, continuing subsequent to the preserved monetary units being appropriately separated, plus monetary reimbursement, justifying the years of my individual exertion that entered generating his enterprise prior to he maintained foundation to attempt cleaving me completely from it. Thomas forfeited significantly extra than simple monetary resources. He forfeited the HVAC enterprise, or nearly everything, subsequent to his companion's departure, and multiple significant customer terminations, abandoned the remaining enterprise insufficiently robust for independent continuance. He liquidated what persisted to a competing organization for tiny fraction of what it had formerly materialized worth. He forfeited the community's automatic confidence we'd inhabited collectively for temporal intervals. The classification of composed professional distinction that necessitates extensive temporal interval developing and dissipates in minimal temporal intervals when individuals discover your precise capabilities. And he forfeited me, although I imagine in his individual consciousness, he'd already determined permitting me departure the moment he positioned with Patricia Vance and commenced organizing a prospect that not one single instance comprised respecting the 22 temporal intervals we'd invested generating one mutually. I'm not going to pretend the previous temporal year S represented uncomplicated. There persisted nocturnal periods, particularly during preliminary stages, when I positioned myself inside the smaller residence and expelled emotional distress regarding the partnership I'd imagined I'd maintained instead of the one I'd actually been inhabiting inside. Emotional devastation doesn't terminate merely because the individual creating it deserved comprehensive devastation. I experienced emotional devastation regarding the Thomas iteration I'd recognized during our preliminary partnership. The individual who'd generate communication inside my consuming arrangement and continue consciousness into preliminary morning intervals supporting my examination preparation. That individual potentially materialized authentically, briefly, prior to motivation and secrecy, progressively converted him into alternative entirely. I granted myself authorization to recognize that loss and subsequently, I gradually permitted myself movement forward without him. What I experienced instead constitutes more challenging positioning a monetary worth uncompared to absolutely everything Diane and I contested regarding inside that arrangement. I recovered my individual judgment, confidence to thoroughly examine every material previous to authorizing, to pose difficult questioning with no requirement for apologizing. I recovered a quieter emotional stability, the classification originating from comprehending you've experienced the most severe classification of relationship betrayal matrimony, can generate and discovered internal resources for managing it appropriately instead of uncomplicated fashion. I recovered emotional connections that intensified subsequent to individuals' observations of managing those temporal intervals. Females from my professional organization starting frequent entertainment requests. A neighboring property inhabitant a couple of dwellings away transforming into greatest friend I've encountered across extended temporal intervals. I recovered myself. Genuinely, the version of Susan Clark I inhabited prior to I studied to minimize my individual instinctive responses for someone else's psychological security. Last Sunday, my personally closest companion Karen positioned herself across from me positioning my outside seating, maintaining heated containers, feeling temperature decrease opposition to emerging vernal coldness, and she posed something I'd not appropriately prepared regarding. If you'd maintained capacity to navigate backward toward that Tuesday, she articulated, realizing everything it would eventually create, would you continue making that identical arrival throughout your temporary break? I didn't require extended temporal interval for contemplation. Absolutely, individually, I communicated, and I communicated it with comprehensive sincerity. Because supposing I hadn't appeared that particular day, supposing I'd maintained my position at my professional workspace and completed my portable consumption and proceeded with my regular afternoon execution, I possess comprehensive conviction I would have ultimately authorized that concluding material. I would have forfeited the residence, the retirement monetary resources, the business I'd personally created with my hands through extended temporal intervals neither of us will ever recuperate. I would have experienced consciousness one day, perhaps numerous temporal intervals afterward, to identify myself with nothing and zero comprehending regarding how that obtained. Instead, one spontaneous decision to authenticate someone claiming sickness concluded rescuing the continuance of my existence. In case you're processing this, and you've ever possessed that identical composed, uncomfortable sensation, that interior communication suggesting something isn't appropriately aligned, even supposing you're unable, yet for articulating precisely why, I encourage you to trust it. Confidence doesn't suggest abandoning difficult questioning. Occasionally, the individuals maintaining us additionally maintain responsibility regarding precision. And we maintain obligation to ourselves to locate that precision when something appears inappropriate.